Hello, I'm Celine, welcome back to my channel, and today I thought I would talk about some of the books that I've finished recently. First of all is a book that I actually didn't finish, and that is How to Read a Poem by Terry Eagleton. I realized pretty quickly that the title of this book is somewhat misleading because it's really not about how to read a poem, it's a lot more about the sort of theoretical debate around poetry. And initially I thought that was quite interesting, but as I kept reading, I kept getting more and more frustrated with this book. It just never felt particularly satisfying. Theoretically, it sort of discusses a lot of the theories from the 80s, but then it doesn't bring that up to present day, and honestly the 80s are quite a long time ago, and in academic terms, the 80s are actually quite a long time ago. In terms of learning how to actually interpret poems, like how to read a poem, this book completely skipped over the idea of interpretation as a process and something that can be followed step by step, and just dove straight into Eagleton's readings of various poems without any sort of explanation about how he got to his conclusions. He sort of gave the impression that scholarly interpretation is a completely intuitive process. And to be fair, I do think there's a lot of subjectivity in how we interpret art, and even within academia, there is a lot of that. I didn't think that this book did a good job of showing or teaching how we move from a very subjective interpretation of art, and how by revealing the subjectivity and revealing our own position as a reader, you can then move into a more academic interpretation. This book just doesn't really engage with that discussion. Even if you're just reading it as a sort of introductory work, which was kind of what I was hoping for, because I've been educated in literature, but not so much poetry, and I was like, I just want to get to grips with the things that make poetry poetry. However, I felt like even as an introductory work, it just wasn't particularly useful. There are very, very few footnotes, so it doesn't really engage with a lot of scholarly debate in its interpretations of different poems. And I kind of noticed that a lot of the footnotes were actually to Terry Eagleton's other works. Nor is there a guide to further reading, which I think is absolutely essential. If you're providing an introductory book, you're supposed to signpost where people can go, and not just only point to your own writing. How to Read a Poem to me just felt like a really oddly insular work, and I ended up not finishing it and just returning it to the library. The next book that I actually finished and also enjoyed was Notes from Underground by Dostoevsky. This was published in 1864, and I read the version that was available for free from Project Gutenberg. For some odd reason, I couldn't find the translator of that version. This strange little novella features a protagonist who used to be a civil servant and who has since then retreated underground, literally. What I found really fascinating was that the protagonist of this book, as he is narrating his life story, has a really antagonistic relationship to the reader. He will lie, he will try to offend the reader. He's just intensely unlikable and constantly draws attention to that fact. Some of the lines of the first page of the book give a really good impression of what that looks like. So it reads, "I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man. I used to be in the government service, and no longer. I was a spiteful official. I was rude and took pleasure in being so. I did not take bribes, you see, so there is bound to be some recompense in that at least. A poor jest, but I will not scratch it out. I wrote it thinking it would sound very witty, but now that I've seen myself that I only work to show off in a despicable way, I will not scratch it out on purpose." I found this really fascinating, and the way this story is narrated sort of reflects on the philosophy that Dostoevsky is actually sort of commenting on in this book. The protagonist sort of rebels against the idea that human behavior is at its core rational. I was really impressed with the writing, especially how it sort of plays with the implicit relationship between the reader and the narrator. Usually this is a really harmonious relationship. It's almost like a window pane, and we just easily get into the book and into the character. This is absolutely not the case in Notes from Underground, and drawing attention to that fact I thought was really interesting. The only aspect of the book that I didn't really enjoy was that at some point, I understand that this main character is unlikable, but he goes on this like misogynist rant against a sex worker, and he's like, "Oh, sex work degrades you," and I understand we're not supposed to find the narrator sympathetic in any sort of capacity, And I would also therefore not claim that Dostoevsky was like extremely misogynist or anything like that. I just found that this section just went on for so long and I was like just turning the pages being like, can you please be done with this now? Overall, I think this book is really accessible in terms of like, if we think about Russian literature and we think about the big chonkers of like War and Peace and that sort of thing. Notes from Underground, although there's so much to discover and there's so many layers, I think it's actually quite accessible. I think it's a really rewarding book and I look forward to sort of returning it perhaps after I've read some more Dostoevsky and see how I feel about it then. Next up, I finished the Grasmere Journals by Dorothy Wordsworth, and I read this beautiful large edition with lots of pictures and drawings in it, but I am not going to keep holding this up. Dorothy Wordsworth was an English poet and writer who lived from 1771 to 1855. She's the sister of the Romantic poet William Wordsworth, and his fame usually sort of eclipses her, and a lot of people don't even know that he had a sister. These diaries were kept roughly between 1800 and I think it was January 1803, while she lived in a cottage with William in the Lake District. There hasn't really been that much recognition for Dorothy, both in terms of her own writing, including this journal, but also the editing that she did for William. I really enjoyed reading these journals because between the sort of boring day-to-day notes of like, oh, the weather was like this, oh, I baked bread today. Dorothy is also a really excellent observer, so she writes really, really beautiful descriptions, particularly of the nature around Grasmere. But she's also sometimes really interested, particularly in the beggars that she meets or that sort of stop by. Dorothy and William had a very intense relationship, and as a modern reader, it sort of feels like sometimes it's oddly codependent, but there are also some slightly uncomfortable romantic undertones to it. For example, Dorothy calls William her beloved, and the night before William was marrying his fiancée, Dorothy put on the wedding ring, and then when William caught her, he was like, oh no, you can keep it on, and you just felt like, bit weird. Overall, this was a fascinating glimpse into what life was like, especially daily life was like, at a turn-of-the-century sort of rural village. I particularly found this a very relaxing read. I just love to, you know, at the end of my day, just grab this book, leaf through it a little bit and just read what Dorothy was up to about 200 years ago. The next book that I finished is 3 Guineas by Virginia Woolf. This is a non-fiction book, particularly about war, but also about women's position in society and particularly how to prevent war and how women sort of tie into that. I'm going to make a separate video about Virginia Woolf's non-fiction, so I will talk about this book a little bit more there, but this was really good. The next book that I finished is The Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Aurelius was the emperor of the Roman Empire between 161 and 180 when he passed away. And the Meditations are sort of short vignettes that he wrote to himself, so he's constantly talking to himself, which he wrote while he was on campaign. And they provide a really interesting insight in the sort of Stoic tradition of philosophy. So for Aurelius and for a lot of Stoics, the reason is seen as sort of superior over the emotions and just sort of the physical sensations of the body. And I think there's a lot of aspects to Stoic philosophy that still resonate, and there are still people who are really inspired by Stoic philosophy, particularly in the way it discusses temperance, detachment, but also a lot of compassion. One of the things that Aurelius discusses is how pain and suffering can be borne more easily or perhaps even borne without any sort of rational discomfort if we only understand our place within the universe and sort of the cycles that life goes through. I think this doesn't quite work for me because we know a lot more about sort of the connection between the body and the mind, and the body can't really be seen as just some sort of shell where the rational mind is completely detached from it. We know that physical experiences actually influence our rational thinking processes. So in that sense, I think we have moved on a little bit in our understanding in the, 2000 years since the publication of this. What I found quite intriguing was how Augustus, who, is an emperor and was probably very well known within the Roman Empire, how he sort of tells himself not to care too much about fame and not care too much about legacy and to just try to be a good man and for that to be enough because fame will always be lost to the sands of time. I think my favorite part though is this sort of cosmology terminology of his philosophy. He thinks a lot about the elements, about atoms, about just how the universe is sort of constantly revolving and how cycles of life evolve over time. And I often found those sections really beautiful. So for example, in book 7, section 47, he writes, "Survey the circling stars as though you yourself were in mid-course with them. Often picture the changing and rechanging dance of the elements. Visions of this kind purge away the dross of our earthbound life." And I also quite like the image from this section in book 10, which was section 5. "Whatever may happen to you was prepared for you in advance from the beginning of time. In the woven tapestry of causation, the thread of your being had been intertwined from all time with that particular incident." I can easily see myself sort of going back to this little book and just leafing through it and reading some sections if I feel like I just need to be told to get it together by Marcus Aurelius. Finally, I also finished The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, which was published in 1907. Conrad is mainly known for his novella The Heart of Darkness, which is about colonialism and violence and is sort of set within Africa. The Secret Agent is a completely different kind of novel. The novel opens to an almost Dickensian London of the 1880s, all like dark fog, damp, rain, cold. And there we meet Verloc, who is a secret agent who has infiltrated radical circles. The plot then revolves around a terrorist attack using a bomb. And Conrad was inspired by an actual bombing that happened in 1894 concerning a French anarchist. And though this is a short novel, we hop around between a lot of different characters. So we have Verloc, the secret agent, but we also sort of get into the mind of a police detective, the boss of the police detective, one of Verloc's comrades. One of the themes that I found really interesting was the tacit relationship between police and criminals and how there are almost rules in how they relate to each other, almost like there is some sort of game that is played between them where both sides know their roles. This book is, amongst other things, about how terrorism kind of sort of blows by these rules and how terrorism is a form of violence that is senseless and meaningless. In terms of writing, Conrad made some odd choices in this book. He chooses some phrases that he sort of repeats over and over. Generally, Conrad has an excellent grasp of language and immense skill in terms of his writing, but sometimes it felt like he was almost showing off what he could do and sort of lost sight of the story he was actually supposed to be telling in the meantime. Equally, the structure is sort of creaking along by the end. Even though this is quite a short book, it did kind of feel like it wasn't quite as cohesive as you might want. It is also worth knowing that one of the characters in this book has a mental disability, and the way that's treated will raise some eyebrows for modern readers. Overall, I thought it was quite atmospheric. I really enjoyed the almost Dickensian London that Conrad writes. And it was also interesting to see discussions of terrorism, but from like an early 20th century perspective. However, it wasn't quite as smooth a read as I would have hoped or expected from Conrad. And that is all of the books that I finished recently, and also all of the books that I didn't finish recently. Let me know if you've read any of these books, if you enjoyed any of these books, if you hated any of these books, and I hope you're doing well, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye!